Thomas, thank you very much for joining me today on the Impact Talks. It is wonderful to have you here, and I'm very, very much excited to have this conversation with you.
And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for driving the topic of sustainable procurement forward. I think that's a worthy endeavor, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you.
Thank you. Well, actually, since you've already mentioned sustainable procurement, I know that your journey in leading procurement functions and also in sustainability is spanning for over a decade. And there is a wealth of knowledge that I really want us to delve into over the following 30 to 40 minutes. So I will just throw you into the deep end immediately. And what I want to hear from you is what sparked your interest around sustainability, and in particular about advancing sustainability within the procurement functions.
It's true. I've been working in procurement for a couple of decades, and I've been working with the topic of sustainability for even longer. There's been many developments, and it's something that I have followed very closely. So how did it all start? I think it started with my first job, almost the first company I worked for. And I was involved in different divisions, different activities. But at one point, the career took me to become a timber trader. And I moved to Africa. I was living in Ghana, being engaged in how do you source timber that would be used for industrial use, whether it was in Europe, North America, in the Arabic countries as well. So I was literally coexisting with the jungle, and it allowed me first insight into the practices that existed, all the good practices, of which there were many. And there were many people, organizations, ODA, I remember in Ghana, was deeply involved in how do you run a forest operation sustainably. But you also saw, of course, things that didn't work out all that well. And that's how it sparked the general interest that if you are in the rainforest, it's important you know what you do, but maybe even more important, you know what not to do. And that then got reinforced. I moved after a couple of years to Indonesia. I was living in Jakarta. I was traveling up the rivers in Sumatra, in Borneo, seeing also the migration that happened, or the conversion of forests towards palm oil plantations. And again, being there firsthand, seeing what is the impact on society at large, how do you balance the local demand for economic progress with a general care for the environment that you have to protect as well. So the constant sort of trade-off was part of my job from already back then. That was also when the first certification schemes were introduced, FSC, there was Smartwood, and that sort of evolution of certification was one that I observed. And that was then in my first job. Then later, as I decided eventually to leave that trade, I had the chance to work for an American company, Johnson & Johnson, that also, as part of their underlying philosophy, corporate philosophy, took this topic of sustainability super seriously. And I was given the chance to lead the engagement around palm oil. So the whole creation in the early days with the RSPO was something that I followed, the coalition with Unilever. So I've had many experiences. And why? Because I fundamentally believe that this is our responsibility. We got to balance our desire for economic growth with the grounded realities and what is it that the planet can ultimately serve with us. So the environmental and the social. So that's how I was raised, and that's what I think should be an integral part of my job. And I can. Thankfully, I work for a great company, Bayer, who is also making sure that how we operate is in balance with nature and the economic ambitions that we have as a company.
It's so interesting to see how it evolved from really seeing the direct impacts then and there, and then to understanding that economic growth can basically coexist with taking care of the environment, with having a positive social impact as well on the society as a whole. And I think that every single area that you've mentioned kind of touched upon how interconnected our world is, and how the procurement function in general and supply chains build on this interconnectivity. And actually, in line with this, before we really go into the current state and also the future of sustainable procurement, I wanted to get your perspectives on how would you define, for those listeners that aren't necessarily familiar with sustainable procurement or that don't really understand it because it's very complex, how would you define sustainable procurement as a whole? How have you seen it evolving, and how far long do we still have to go?
So when I talk about sustainable procurement, I want us to operate in a manner that is environmentally in line with the ambitions. It is socially in line with all the criteria as defined by the United Nations Global Compact. It's labor practices, human rights. It's minimizing inequality that you would also see. So economically responsible, that the ambitions that the shareholders in most of the companies that are privately owned are also being considered. So it's really the environmental, it's the social, and it's the economical dimension. And why is it that procurement is important? I think if you start from almost the beginning of any product that you would have in your hand, it comes from a natural resource. It comes from a mine. It comes from a forest. It comes from an ocean. There are many steps from the raw material until the final products are meeting the consumers. And behind each of those transactions, which equals the world economy, sits two people typically behind each deal. There's a seller and there is a buyer. And if we can activate the procurement community across the whole world, across that whole value chain, to make better decisions and not exclusively look at one dimension when they make their decision, make sure that the environmental impact, the carbon footprint of your decisions is integrated into your decision, that's the best chance we have to transform how business is conducted across the world. So that when consumers are finally getting their phone or their whatever in their hands, they can also be reassured that this is a product that has been created minimizing the impact across the whole value chain until you buy that. And then of course we need to make sure that the consumers also get into the practice of dispersing it in a responsible way, that we're also looking at recycling, reconditioning, etc. But I believe that the fact that behind the world economy, at each point you see a procurement person, that's an incredible power that we need to also make sure is being utilized for good.
Yeah, 100%. And actually this makes me think, in general, when it comes to the larger organizations, as you very well said, there has been, I think, particularly in the past couple of years, an uptick in terms of sustainability commitments, not only looking within the immediate boundaries of the business, within their operations, and how can they further impact their employees in a positive way, or maybe going at the consumer level with a direct product impact, but there has been increasingly an interest into extending that within supply chains. So basically we've had even the world's largest tech corporations committing to become carbon neutral within the following 5 to 10 years, depending on how long that journey is going to take. We've also had an increased interest in organizations committing to protect human rights, again, at a manufacturing level in countries that are susceptible in terms of, those haven't been really abided by and so on. But when it comes to them, to these large organizations, and we've seen it in the current situation too, they have the control, they have the risk management, they have the policies, the processes, and the internal resources as well to actually make it happen. when we look and we zoom into the SMEs that basically are the contributors to the world economy, that employ the largest proportion of population, particularly in the developing world, these are the ones that don't really know where to start with sustainability in general, how to look at it, how to really put together a long-term vision for the organization, and how to start embedding from grassroots at the supply chain level sustainability. So from this point of view, if you were to advise the smaller companies to how to go about it, how would you advise them to steer away from just looking at the cost side and embedding sustainability?
Yeah, so I agree. If we do not engage the small, medium-sized enterprises or the micro enterprises, or people who is really out there who is contributing every day to the economy, if we don't activate them and we focus exclusively on the larger multinationals, we will miss a humongous part of that whole value chain, and it simply wouldn't work. So it's important that they are in the game. And there is a community that is also here to help them, because I think it's also important for any small, medium-sized organization to accept that there is no silver bullet. There is not one single way that is the right approach towards this topic. It's a journey, and everybody needs to start. And the dogma that exists in certain organizations that sustainability is a resource-intensive activity that is going to cost a lot of money is simply not true. Sustainability means also that you are eliminating waste, you are becoming efficient, you are looking at ways of challenging the waste streams. And with that, of course, it's simply good business to be sustainable. How to then get started, I think that's a bit where, of course, also the Procurement Pledge has a ambition. It is a pledge that has been established to have that knowledge brokering for the people who have already had experiences, who is more than happy to share almost the do's and the don'ts. What is it that works? What is it that we have experienced that doesn't work? And it's important that we have those real cases of real human beings facing real problems displayed openly, such that the small, medium-sized participants also can see that there is no, again, magic way. It is about trying it out, seeing if it works, adjusting, getting better, and moving on. That's what we want to encourage. So we are very, very focused on the small, medium-sized companies and make sure that they are equipped.
I love it that you've mentioned, I'm going to build on this actually, that there is a journey when it comes to sustainability, because I also feel that it is an ever-evolving field, and it has so many multiple dynamics that we are far from achieving perfection, and we know that there is no such thing as perfection. And with this constant need of the organizations to be perfect in what they do to ensure that they excel, sometimes this might also be the area that prevents them from actually doing more and more, but building on the learnings of others and really seeing what works and what doesn't work within their organizations. Because again, if we look at, for instance, when it comes to a hospitality establishment, that should be and could be treated when it comes to sustainability very differently to, for instance, a healthcare organization. Supply chains are different, and of course company practices and processes are also different. So since you've brought up the Sustainable Procurement Pledge that I'm very excited about, and I know that you have a very ambitious mission, which is by 2030 to ensure that sustainable procurement is embedded within the corporate strategies and within the organizational strategies across the globe. Why don't you tell me more about it? Why is it that you've started it, and how can others also participate? What has happened so far?
Yeah, so again, back to the underlying assumption, the world, the way it is progressing, the way that we are dependent on fossil fuel, the way that we experience economic growth, world population increases, has a need for a fundamental change. I think the science behind the way that carbon emissions are being generated and that it goes beyond the boundaries of our planetary capability is well known. So there is a need for change. And that message has been communicated by many people over the last couple of years, and yet there's limited progress. So, we've seen organizations like Friday for Future, and the one that triggered this initiative was actually the climate change that was in, I think it was September last year, where also, of course, the kids, the Friday for Future, but also adults, so people from all walks of life, went to the streets across the world and said, we have a big responsibility. There's one planet, it's our home. We need to make sure that the progress that we experience as a species doesn't happen at the sacrifice of the subsequent generations. And I sort of thought, wow, that's a good message. It was David Attenborough and Jane Goodall, and there were different people in a video. And I, on LinkedIn, made my belief known that I think this is a call for action. Let's make sure we are taking our responsibility really, really seriously. And it triggered really a lot of interest and comments from across my community, whether it was professional, active procurement professionals, whether it was sellers, academia, and they all encouraged, let's do something. And that's exactly what then I did together with Bertrand Concouré, who is my co-founder on SPP. We talked on a Saturday morning and said, what can we do? And the idea was born around a pledge, not one that tries to compete with everything else that is going on, because there are many good things going on, but one that really complements the existing corporate, national trade activities, but one that focuses on the individual. And that's what it is. It's a set of principles. It's 5 principles where we say it's almost like a professional codex that we say we stand for those principles. And a lot of it is around sharing and listening. It's about protecting the people, but also the planet, being also prepared to stand up, have courage, but also starting with ourselves. So the ambassadors are saying we start with ourselves. Some have big responsibilities, some have smaller responsibilities, but we are all equal, and we all want to make sure that this power we have as a procurement professional is used for good. And that became part of that process. It was very inclusive. So academia was lining up very, very quickly, saying, we want to be part of that. Because we also have to recognize that a lot of the work that is coming as a consequence of the pledge and the thankfully increased focus on sustainable practices, of course, lies with the next generation. It's the people who is today sitting in universities learning how to become procurement professionals. And we want to make sure that they are equipped from the onset, that the curriculum they're exposed to reflects the reality of how we are operating. And then we want to focus on people entering the profession who is having all these questions. Where should we start? What's next? What's a nice way of approaching it? And that's what this community is now putting together. We have created a website, a collaboration space, spp.earth, where we are gradually going through the 10 biggest challenges for procurement professionals. We have team members, it's all volunteers, so it's all pro bono. They are collecting great content, making sure we collect experiences from the community, maybe from people who have a little bit more experience that are prepared to share. And that's a community that we have started. We started with a handful of people. Today, I think we are at 1,500 plus, and we are growing. And we even have an outrageous ambition, because we believe there's around 1 million procurement people on the planet, across small, medium enterprises and bigger, larger organizations. And we want everybody to participate. So the ambition is to have all 1 million participating at the pledge. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, but it's, again, a prerequisite for making sure that we are standing up to our principle and that is protecting the planet for our children, the next generation that's coming.
A lot of work, but also a very exciting work, and a work that really trickles down to the smaller organizations and can impact positively the procurement practices, and also accelerate progress towards the sustainable development goals. Because if you're bringing all the actors together, and we always say that, right? Bringing academia, bringing government, bringing the small and medium enterprises in a joint collaboration effort, so that we can further progress rather than just making the commitments but not actually knowing how to implement them. So I think that this is fantastic, and congratulations for already reaching over 1,500 participants. I think that given the fact that you've very recently started, it is a fantastic progress. Now, how can other organizations and individuals get involved? Do they just need to visit the website? What they can do in order to support furthering the mission of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge?
Yeah, so we want to be very, very open and inclusive. So anybody, whether you are a procurement professional, an academic, or from different industries that believe in those principles, you're very welcome to join. And there are two ways. There's a LinkedIn group called the Sustainable Procurement Ambassadors. Anybody who wants to participate, see all the narrative, the posts that are happening within the community can go that way. Likewise, you can also sign up at the collaborative space that we have, spp.earth, where you will also be able to make it known what are the areas that you are most interested in, and what are the areas that you would like to contribute with. So, as I said, we have a ever-increasing group of volunteers who is helping us sort out the wealth of activities which are coming our way. One is around making sure we have all the right content. We are not trying to recreate content. There's enough ideas and experience, lots of institutions, universities, and they're all very prepared to share. So we have a team that collects the best of the best and makes that available. Then we have a lot of meetings, we have calls where we share. There's a team preparing for that. We want to, of course, reach out more proactively to organizations who have not yet engaged, to understand, are they aware? Is there a reason why they haven't joined something we believe is so obvious? And help channel them towards the pledge. Having also leadership dialogues. So, of course, a lot of people in procurement organizations feel that they are restricted in operating totally free if the boss, and that could be the CPO or any of the senior leadership in procurement, but also the company, if they are not endorsing it. So there is a bit of education that needs to happen with the leaders, which we are also engaged in. And quite frankly, we need to have people on all these dimensions. So anybody who is prepared to help, we are very happy to hear from them.
And I think it is a great time to launch something like this, especially because now in all the economic reconstruction efforts, I think that sustainability has becoming more and more under the spotlight. Even if we look at the asset managers and how they increasingly have been stating that the ESG portfolios are performing much better despite the pandemic. Now I think that is going to further trickle down, and sustainability is going to play a key role in our long-term recovery. And since we are at the current situation, what do you think, like in your perspective, what would the impact of the pandemic be in general on sustainability, and in particular on sustainable procurement? Would we see more and more frequently organizations really looking into this and establishing the foundation for, at the end of the day, a sustainable future?
So I think the COVID pandemic has shown us almost the best of procurement, but has also shown the face of almost the worst of procurement. If I go into what is it that we've seen, which I would categorize as absolute best, is we've seen a wealth of collaboration happening across companies, across industry players, with governments, with NGOs. I mean, there's been so much collaboration across society in dealing with an unknown, risk that came our way. And I think that's the spirit that I'd like to make sure we keep, and that this will be the one that fuels the way that we will challenge climate change as a big topic. So I think there's been a lot of really, really good things. It has also broken a lot of the established norms, some of the corporate dogmas or how to conduct business. And one of the obvious topics is around how do you work? Home office, we are both in our home office. Up until a few months ago, people didn't believe that was a viable option. Well, that is becoming the norm. Likewise, travel. There were many common assumptions that business to business could hardly be conducted without anybody looking each other in the eyes and giving a handshake, and you had to travel on long distance to conduct deal. Well, it's not necessary. So it has diluted a lot of these wrong dogmas that existed. And I think that's the spirit that I like to keep as we move forward. It has also shown, unfortunately, some of the worst, and that's where I think we are a bit at a crossroad. There is no doubt that many companies, many industries are fighting for survival. We've seen, unfortunately, that many companies are not capable of surviving the pandemic, and with that, the procurement teams in many of those organizations have gone down the cost first glide path and almost pushed the pressure that their own companies have experienced into the supply chain. And whilst of course it's tempting if you are fighting for survival, it has meant that there are certain procurement organizations who have forgotten that again, sustainability is good business and it's over a longer period of time. And that's what now we need, each of us individually, but also as companies, to make up our mind. Are we going to stay on this old path of cost only, knowing that it's not sustainable and it's going to lead us into the wrong direction? Or will we mature as individuals, as organizations, to start looking behind what appears to be the truth and avoid this zero-sum philosophy, which unfortunately exists in many organizations? So my heart, but also my conviction is that the good will win, but we have to recognize that right now there is a tension going on, and we hear both voices. Go back, cost only, survival, push the pressure of the supply chain, and the other, which is more long-term, that we need to find new ways of creating value together with maybe even building on the topic of sustainability.
Yeah, so, and I think you rightly said that the behaviors have changed, and also the norms that we were used to were challenged to the extent that now we realize that some of the old ways of doing business will no longer apply. And although now there is, of course, a very challenging situation for many, as you rightly mentioned, with businesses being on survival mode, I think that the immediate thing that we've seen at a global level is the cost cutting. How do you go about managing your cash flow properly? Would you take care of the employees first? Would you look into long-term recovery? I think that that's going to come now secondary in the recovery phase. And when I'm an eternal optimist myself, and especially when it comes to sustainability, given that it's been so widely discussed now. And I think that we finally really understand that sustainability isn't just about cutting down on plastics, for instance, but it has to be truly embedded within the business model, within the corporate strategies, and to balance that need for economic growth with the way that you impact the society, your employees, and in your supply chains, the environment, because only when we have a balance, the triple bottom line reporting, basically amongst these three, that's when we can also keep under control unprecedented events, and we can navigate much easier such circumstances.
Yeah, and there's really a lot of good stuff happening. So I'm with you. I'm per definition very, very optimistic, and I believe that we as a species will come together when the challenge is large enough and find a solution. But what is already happening is, of course, many corporations have already signed up for, first of all, the United Global Compact, which are the principles linked also in the pledge. The SDGs by 2030, most organizations are starting to converge towards using them as a roadmap for what they're doing with their own activities. Same applies for smaller companies. We see business models around the SDGs and new innovation and value that is being created on the back of circular economy, etc. So there's really a lot happening on that way. But then also companies signing up to the science-based targets. So where there are some really bold commitments around their own carbon neutrality, the renewable energy, etc., where procurement becomes absolutely critical, because any company who signs up for the science-based targets are also per definition committing to reductions in scope 1 and 2, which is your internal, as well as scope 3, which is everything you are sourcing. And that's where procurement will have to get ready for the new currency, which is around carbon. So yes, it is of course about quality, reliability, and price, but very soon we're going to start modeling into carbon, so that that becomes a currency, a variable that we will have to model around with. And that's really exciting. That's where big impacts are possible into the supply chains. And more companies are signing up for that. I'm, again, lucky. I work for a company that has done that. So Bayer is 100% behind these bold commitments, and that's what my team is getting ready to deliver against.
And I think that for a large company like Bayer is even more complex to go within the supply chains and really embed sustainability because they are widely spread all across the world, and the processes have to be thoroughly thought through rather than smaller organizations. Now, actually, before letting you go, there is always that debate that if you want to really cut on your carbon footprint, particularly in your supply chains, then you need to internalize them. On the other hand, sometimes internalizing supply chains might put even more pressure on the resources that exist. So in your opinion, and this is something that I will let the listeners also think about, should we look into moving the supply chains within the countries of operations, or what is it we need to consider when we are taking such bold decisions?
Yeah, so I think the discussion is going on, and you hear almost very polarized arguments about one or the other. I don't think the reality is that it's that simple. And I think behind each decision anybody would do, it has to be a consideration of what's the ultimate carbon impact of what you're doing. Taking a large setup which is operating in a sustainable manner and forcing it into 10 smaller units, not necessarily having the proximity to the raw materials, may give you with a very, very unattractive carbon footprint. So behind each of those decisions should be some science and some intelligence, and we should be careful not to jump on either one or the other. But that's exactly what we have to now commit to. And I think each of us, each company, has to look at, where does it make sense to localize, create different hubs and spokes from a manufacturing, and where does it make sense to have a more global manufacturing footprint where maybe the access to renewable energy is more favorable. So, I would say let's not fall into the trap of being too polarized, but recognize it's super, super complex. And that's as well what I said that we are working on with my day job. So is that also coming out of the COVID experience. You said it's complex. Yes, it is complex, but we also didn't start yesterday. Many of these big initiatives that we are working on started already 10 years ago. We are a founding member of Together for Sustainability. We were one of the first companies that signed up for the UN Global Compact. We are participating in the pharmaceutical supply chain initiative, and all of these signal that we believe in unilateral approaches to deal with these challenges. And what we saw in COVID, what is it our company do? We make sure we have medicine, and we make sure that we can also feed the world. Health for all and hunger for none. And I think that's exactly what we saw in the COVID reality, that there was no interruption of our supply chain. And why was it that it worked? It worked because we have spent the last 10 years figuring out who are the right companies to work with. How do we make sure that they are operating in a sustainable manner, that they have the management practices? So sustainable supply chains, for me, equals resilient supply chains. These two topics are totally interdependent. And I think also, moving into a world of VUCA, where we have to anticipate more volatility and things we didn't plan for. Having resilience is critical, and that's where sustainable practices will help as well.
100%. And I loved it that you again mentioned the fact that it's been a 10-year journey for an organization as large as Bayer. And again, it's not something that can happen overnight to become fully sustainable. It is a journey. And I think that that's what we need to acknowledge. And going back to really making such decisions, I think that what I would like to do is really to encourage all the listeners to look into the Sustainable Procurement Pledge and see the platform, benefit from the wealth of knowledge that exists already there, and make informed decisions based on also experiences and, as you rightly said, science. So once again, Thomas, thank you very much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it, and it was a pleasure to have you here.
The pleasure was all mine. So we welcome anybody. Please help make sure also that the content of the future keeps improving. So it is about absorbing content and ideas, but it's certainly also contributing to the future. So we hope you will join us.